Good evening, everyone. This is Richard Crompton. We're broadcasting live from Word of Faith Christian Center in Kabeja. And tonight we're going to be doing something really important for our country. Because on the 29th of May, we have an election, and it's the first election in my lifetime. And I was talking to my mom, and I won't give her age away, but in the last major election, the result was up for grabs, like it is in this year, was in 1948. Oops, maybe I did drop it. Maybe I did tell you. Anyway, the bottom line is this is the most important election of our lifetimes. Every other election, the result was certain. It was just a question of whether it would be free and fair and peaceful. But this is why Christians need to really focus in on what we're doing, who they're going to vote for, because increasingly we're seeing the encroachment of religious freedom around the world, and it's coming to South Africa, and you need to incorporate it in what you're voting for. So to have this discussion with me, I've got Michael Swain. Maybe if you could just greet everyone and tell us who you are and what you do. Wonderful. With your mic.
Oh, it's so great to be here. Thank you for having me on this particular program, Richard, and what an important moment we have reached as well. And I absolutely concur. I think this is a pivotal election. And people obviously vote for many different reasons, and they vote for many different parties. But I think one of the things that we have to bear in mind when we come to cast our vote is, to what measure is the party that we're going to vote for going to protect and uphold our religious freedom right, which is guaranteed to us by Section 15 of the Constitution. And FORSA, Freedom of Religion South Africa, we are a legal advocacy group or organization. So we are, I think, particularly important to say, is politically neutral. We do not support any particular political party. We work with all and any political party who has an interest in supporting and promoting and upholding the right to religious freedom. But in this particular scorecard, what we're doing is something which I think is very important, which is to look at how the parties did over the past Parliament. Objectively.
Yes.
100% objectively. So what we've done, and what I hope will be helpful, is we've prepared what we call a religious freedom scorecard.
Yes.
And we've gone through every single piece of legislation that was put forward during this past Parliament that we identified concerns about religious freedom. In other words, we felt that there was some potential threat to limit or erode in some way the right to religious freedom. And that, of course, is very important, because bad laws lead to bad outcomes. And I think one of the reasons why we have in this nation let's say, a relatively secure position for religious freedom is because we have protected it, we have upheld it, we have defended it. And so we now want to see how the parties did in this instance, and how we can potentially consider that their performance, because what obviously has been their performance before is a pretty good indication of what their performance will be in the future.
Yes, behavior today is a predictor of behavior tomorrow.
Correct.
Now, maybe I think if you could just give us a sketch of the sort of legal prowess, expertise that sits behind FORSA.
So we have a tremendous legal team, but we have particularly a full-time attorney who has extensive experience and expertise in religious freedom law. That's Liesl Pretorius. She is a star and a wonder. And we also have at the moment, and we've had previous attorneys, we had Daniela Ellebeck, who many people will know, and she was with us for 7 years.
She's now been promoted, or not, she's now the head of a foundation.
Yes, yeah, she's doing very well. And of course, Advocate Nadine Badenhorst. So she's a highly experienced advocate.
Yes.
And then we also have a kind of an extended legal advisory board, of which, Richard, you are one, being an advocate as you are, and others too. And so we call on the highest levels of expertise, particularly those who understand constitutional law and religious freedom law particularly. And what we do is, when we see a piece of legislation coming through, we analyze it, and we identify whether or not, or what is the level of threat in that, and we try to make it understandable, because sometimes legal bills are pretty complex and convoluted.
And boring.
And boring. And we then try to make it understandable to the average man. And we particularly try and say, what does the current law say, which potentially is what we want to uphold and defend?
Yes.
Because very often these laws are eroding existing rights.
Yes.
You won't get much more right to religious freedom granted.
Yes.
You're only going to see an erosion, and that's why we have to defend.
Sadly, yes.
Sadly.
Just to confirm, so there are two senior counsel on our panel, and then also a professor of constitutional law acts as an advisor as well.
Yes, absolutely.
So when FORSA takes a position, it's a considered opinion.
Yeah, very considered. And always what we're looking for is the legal position. So we are also faith neutral. That's also important to say.
So maybe explain that a bit.
Well, the right to religious freedom is, let's say, a generic right. It's a right that applies equally to all faiths, all beliefs, all opinion, thought, conscience. It protects all of that. And so therefore, it protects ideologies for that matter as well. You could have your opinion, your view, however you want, and that is legally protected. So when we say we're religious or faith neutral, what we mean is that we will defend the right of all faiths to basically say what they want to say, to believe what they want to believe, to express that however they want to. Because, of course, what's good for one is good for all, or what's bad for one is bad for all. Yes. And therefore we do have and have had situations whereby people from faiths other than the Christian faith, which is obviously my personal faith, have also found themselves potentially in trouble in terms of their religious freedom right being eroded. And at that point, we will step in and protect and defend their right to express their belief. One notable example of that would have been, for example, there was a major who was told to remove the head covering that she had, and she wanted to wear it under the beret. And again, the principle there was reasonable accommodation.
Yes.
And of course, if you say to, well, it doesn't matter because
Devon
that's...
Girls High School case.
Yes, there was the one with a little stud through the Pelé case, through the nose. Because of course, if you say, well, take it out, then of course, then Christians can be told, well, take that crucifix off, or take that promise ring off, or, don't wear a cross on your... as a piece of jewelry or something like that. So, yeah, we have to defend it because what's good for one is good for all, what's bad for one is bad for all.
If you take from one, you take from everyone.
Exactly.
And I think it's important for us to protect religious freedom because it's a precious right. And from a Christian point of view, we would, and here I would take off my advocate's hat and put on the pastor's hat, our goal is to win over those who are possibly of a different faith, win them with the love of Jesus, rather than by legislation or anything else. So, so maybe tell us, what do you feel the right to religious freedom really is?
It's a foundational human right because it's actually a basket of human rights. It isn't just, as I said, what you believe and what you want to pray about in the privacy of your own home. It's your right to express those beliefs in private and in public. And it also includes rights, for example, like our right to associate together, our right to assemble together, our right, for example, to, and particularly to educate our children and to raise our children in accordance with our beliefs and our faiths and our values. And that means, therefore, that parental rights are very closely aligned and tied with religious freedom. So it is like a basket of human rights. And frankly, once you start to see religious freedom eroded, every other human right of any value is being eroded at the same time.
In fact, a lot of people... A lot of people feel that a lot of the causes of wars have been religious, although that isn't strictly accurate. But when you take people's religious rights away, it's very often part of a slippery slope to real problems.
Very much so. And it's interesting that human history will show clearly that if there's one thing people are prepared to die for and to fight for, it is their religious freedom. And if you push it to a certain level, and that is why, of course, the courts are very reluctant to interpret a particular religious doctrine, because they know that once they do that, they're overstepping their mark. And that is also, of course, why government should be very careful and wary when it starts to tread on people's religious freedom rights, because that is something which is part of your human dignity. That's what our Constitutional Court has recognized. It's something which is actually innate and inherent to you, and you have that right with you always. Wherever you go, however you are seeing things, that is exactly what right we're trying to protect and promote.
I just want to say a very healthy audience starting to develop. We ask you to do two things. We ask you to please share this link with your friends, let other people know that we're on and broadcasting right now. And for instance, put this link in your WhatsApp status, an amazing way for the word to get out, because people need to know about what we're talking about. This is vital to the future of our country. And then secondly, say hi. So we just want to welcome Kathy, Lulu, and Candace. So good to have you with us. And if you could please share the link as far as possible, because we need to get the scorecard is vital to assessing who to vote for. Now, I just wanted to pick up a strand of what you said, talking about religious freedom and right of association, for instance, and of course, the right to religious freedom became front and center during this particular term of Parliament because of the lockdowns.
Very much so.
And so churches were shut completely while you could go to a casino, go to a theater, go to a gym and a restaurant. So I remember I drove into Plettenberg Bay on the 2nd of January, after they'd refused to allow us to meet at all. And every single restaurant I drove past, that was 2021, was absolutely packed to the hilt, but we weren't allowed to associate. And so we were part of a case where we brought an urgent interdict to have churches reopen, and of course they reopened it the day before, the evening at 8 o'clock the night before we were to be in court. But that was also a multi-religious effort, because of there was a group of Muslim lawyers who were also went to court, and I appreciated that we were working together, because the power. I think that one of the things that people don't understand is how powerful the state is.
Well, I think it was a big wake-up call for the religious community, and maybe particularly for the church, because I think religious freedom had always been kind of taken for granted. Like, why is it an issue? Why is it important? We've always had it. We've always gone to church. We always pray. We've got our cell groups. We've got this. What's the issue? And then suddenly, slam, the doors were literally shut. And if you opened your doors, you were liable to be arrested. In fact, it was so ridiculous in that instance that you were mentioning that I could have sat next to you and we could be playing the slot machines. I mean, God forbid, but we could have been in a casino. And the moment our losses got so bad on the slot machines that we put our hands together to pray, we could have been arrested because that would now be a religious gathering and jailed for 6 months.
Yes.
And this was all supposedly to prevent a disease from being transmitted. So it was obviously discriminatory against the faith community. And as you said, we managed to, with our court case, effectively put enough pressure, because government knew they were going to lose. And they then relinquished it and leveled the playing field. Fair enough.
Yes.
So yes, but a very big wake-up call, I think, that religious freedom is fragile.
Yes.
And if we don't defend our rights, then we can lose them.
And government shifted their position again and again to make sure that they wouldn't lose the court case.
Yeah, yes.
So we want to welcome Jeanette Vakarot, Sinatemba, Bisu, Marilyn Prince, Norman Ngezi, Natalie Ryder from East London, Kolo, Sitatu, Kalyu Prelate. Anyway, please get the word out. I see the audience is really starting to grow now. Now, maybe let's talk about the outlook for the protection of the right to religious freedom internationally. What's happening in the broader globe with regards to protection, and I think here especially the Western world?
Well, the Western world was generally seen as a world that was built upon biblical Christian values. And it was seen almost as, if you were in the Western nation, you were, quote unquote, a Christian nation. And one of the things that has been a trend, and it really has accelerated to the point of almost literally negating that heritage, shall we say, has been the way that what the Western world has moved against people of faith, has eroded religious freedom. One maybe quick example, I went to the University of Bristol in the UK, and when I was there, I asked my professors, what is there that protects our religious freedom rights? And I was assured that England is always and will always be a Christian nation, and we have great heroes of the faith like William Wilberforce and John Wesley and so on and so forth. And we didn't have to worry about that. And yet, literally, not even a generation later, 30 years later, a street pastor was arrested, not even 100 meters from where that declaration was made to me. And all he was doing was he was quoting a scripture. He said, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. And he was arrested for basically disturbing the peace. And the prosecution stated that in 21st century enlightened Great Britain, if you quoted such scriptures in public, it would almost certainly be potentially hate speech, and it would almost certainly be seen as causing a disturbance and a breach of the peace. So that is how quickly you can lose your right if you do not defend it. And that particular pastor was actually convicted and was given a 30,000 rand fine that was overturned on appeal, fair enough. But it just goes to show how quickly that slippery slope can slide.
And I don't think that people, I think many people consider court cases in the context of reading an article, which takes 2 or 3 minutes. But the level of impact that a court case, charges in that case, are brought against someone, it is postponed repeatedly before the trial comes. You have to find legal representation. You have to consult with them properly. You have to go through a trial. There has to be scrutiny of you. Then you go on appeal. So that probably took anything from a year to 2.5 years of that man's life.
Well, there's another case in Norway at the moment with a former MP. She's the current MP, and she tweeted certain scriptures to her own church, criticizing them for the stance that they were taking over Pride Week or something to do with that. And she was then charged with a hate speech crime. And she's been acquitted unanimously twice, but they're 4 years into that case. So again, the punishment can be the process.
Yes.
And it's designed to basically make an example of you, so that it's like, well, even though you might get off at the end, you better not do it, because look what happens. And it can be ruinous. I mean, cancel culture is a real thing.
Yes.
The costs of actually fighting legal cases are also very, very heavy.
Yes.
So, yes, your life is basically...
And the impact.
And the impact on you and on your family and on your friends.
It hangs over you like a sword of Damocles.
Yeah. So, again, the right to religious freedom in the so-called Western world has been dramatically eroded. And don't think that it can't happen in South Africa.
And I remember in 2013, we were adjudged to be the second most religiously free country in the world, behind Brazil. And in both countries, there's been dramatic erosion of that right. I know in Brazil, for instance, right now, they've shut down Twitter, formerly X, formerly Twitter, because certain accounts, the government is unhappy that certain accounts are publicizing protests against the government and things like that. So there's a real erosion of freedom everywhere.
Yeah. It is a general thing, unfortunately.
I just want to welcome Lance Grootboom, Councillor Lance Grootboom. He's watching from Uitenhage. And we want to ask as many that you share this with as many people as possible. Okay, let's get into the election scorecard and the Freedom of Election scorecard, and maybe just tell us what it is.
Well, again, just to repeat, the Election Freedom Scorecard is basically an analysis of all the pieces of legislation that have been put into the public process, shall we say, during this past Parliament. Some have been passed, some are on hold, some have been rejected, but in each and every case, when we looked at those pieces of legislation, they're called a bill before they become passed, and they're called an act. We were looking at is there a potential for religious freedom to be eroded? And in all cases, as we will see, the answer was yes. And then it goes through a process in Parliament. There's public participation. It goes through various different levels. It goes sometimes from the department into Parliament, the National Assembly, and it's dealt with by committees as well. So you have committees that are made up of different political parties, and they are often the ones that decide what happens, what goes through, and what have you. All this is a matter of public record. So that's what we have analysed as well. When we come up with our scorecard, it's not just our view, it's exactly how the political parties voted on matter by matter. We're not giving the reasons why they voted the way they did. You can look that up in Hansard. God help you if you try that. But it is a matter of public record. And so it is a completely neutral scorecard. What we've done is, and we'll see in a minute, the actual scorecard itself. Maybe I could run through and explain what that is and how it works. But again, to say that Freedom of Religion South Africa, FORSA, we are politically neutral. We work with all political parties. Anybody who will protect and uphold and promote religious freedom, any political party, we will obviously want to work with them. And we do. We speak to as many people as possible, even at the committee level, and obviously we lobby quite extensively. So without more ado, and if you want more ado, you can always go to the forsa.org.za website, and you can see a lot of the stuff that we've got there. But
so I think before we actually get into it, what the issue, how they're going to be judged is how they correlate to the left-hand column.
Yes.
How 4SA, what the position was that 4SA took,
yes,
and then how parties accorded it. So red doesn't mean bad,
no,
and green doesn't mean good. It's were they either in favor or did they oppose specific legislation that would have impacted religious freedom?
That's exactly right. So if you look at this scorecard, you'll see that you have basically the name of the particular piece of legislation, then its status, whether it's been passed, whether it was rejected, whether it's still in play. And then for us, what we stand for, obviously we're not a political party, but the crosses or the ticks were basically our view as to what should or should not happen to protect and promote religious freedom. And the other columns are obviously the different political parties, the main ones, and you will see then in the column underneath their icon or their logo, you will then see how they actually voted on each and every matter.
So in one or two exceptions, it may be that the religious convictions of a specific party influenced their viewpoint rather than the neutral protection of religious freedom.
Exactly. And their ideological position obviously will have influenced their voting as well.
So it isn't so important which way they went on specific legislation. It's the overall record.
It's more the trend.
Yeah, you can tell where a party is going according to how they've in the whole.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so
it might be worthwhile saying, because of course not every political party was represented at a committee level in every piece of legislation, and so where you see a dash, it means that there was no particular position taken by any of them. They were kind of, let's say, neutral, or the question mark means that there was no disclosure of their position. So again, we've tried to make it factual, and of course where there are dashes, in many instances, particularly where the smaller parties are concerned, it means that they weren't actually in the committee. They didn't have representation.
Tell me, with the crosses and the ticks, so if you see a green cross, what does that mean?
A green cross typically means that they voted against the bill.
Okay.
And a red tick means that they voted for it. Red typically means bad, but not in every instance. But we can go through now item by item, and then after every item, in case you're wondering, we're going to show you the religious freedom scorecard again, so that then you can just cross-reference from a top. We're going to go down the list from the cybercrimes bill right the way through to the marriage bill at the bottom, and then you can see how things are going.
So let's have a look at the cybercrimes bill. What was the cybercrimes bill about?
So this was basically online communication, essentially. And what they were criminalizing, and it is now a criminal offense, was what they call malicious communication. And the original version of the bill contained definitions which we felt were definitely too broad, especially those concerning harmful messages, so-called, and what happens with fake news. And of course, that opens the door to potential violations.
What was the concern that the bill was trying to address?
It was basically trying to stop people from, or anybody from expressing views that were harmful online, that were malicious online, that were effectively, let's say, akin to hate speech, that type of thing. But it went broader. And that's always the problem. You know, we often say that the devil's in the definition.
Yes.
And so with these broad definitions, our submissions are very often to say, we would like to see the definitions changed, and we give them an alternative definition that we would like to see incorporated. Again, law is essentially very technical, in as much as literally one word out of place can actually make a whole difference. Even a comma can make a difference.
Famously, we were back in 1984, when the denomination came for us, they won the case over a comma, an absent comma.
Interesting.
So commas are important, sadly.
So with this bill, again, the good news is, and again, thanks to everybody who supports us, because we have often a public participation process that we encourage people to engage with. And it is typically that gives us the status, if you like, so that when we go into Parliament, we have a voice. And when we speak to members of Parliament, they know that behind us, it's not just us as an organisation, it's all the people who stand behind us. And that is why, for example, in this particular bill, most of the concerning definitions were actually removed before the bill was passed. So we had some residual concerns because we believe that it went beyond what the Constitution says should be protected, justifiably.
Yes.
But nevertheless, the overarching result of that was that we managed to defang, to a large extent, the problems in this bill.
So let's maybe go back to the scorecard. And there we say FORSA still continued to oppose the bill because of
we would have voted against it, because we also felt that a lot of that bill was covered in existing legislation, and therefore you didn't need additional. But again, you can see going across, the ANC obviously voted for it. In fact, in most cases, of course, it's the ANC that is proposing the bill.
With one exception.
With one exception, yes, interestingly enough, which is the Disaster Management Amendment Bill, and we'll get to that. And the other parties, you can see how they voted just by looking across the top line. Again, we're not saying why people voted the way that they did. We don't have that.
So this isn't necessarily the Christian position. This is the protection of religious freedom position.
Exactly. And also, in some instances, that people might see it as they might believe that it's necessary for whatever other reason they see that it's necessary. So again, we're not judging or evaluating any party's position. We're simply reporting.
From Hansard.
Particularly. Hansard is the official parliamentary record that literally records every single thing that happens in Parliament.
Let's go to the next one, the Civil Union Amendment Bill.
So this bill we were particularly concerned about. The Civil Union Act was passed as a consequence of a constitutional court case, I think it was the Fareed case, which legalized same-sex marriage. And so in that case, the Constitutional Court said that because sexual orientation is a protected right under the Constitution, that same-sex couples had the right to marry. And the consequence was that Parliament had to pass a piece of legislation, the Civil Union Act, and they did so. Interestingly enough, in the judgment, Justice Sachs said specifically that he felt that state-employed marriage officers should have could have their constitutional right to religious freedom protected. A bill was introduced by COPE, I believe, and the COPE party, and they wanted that particular protection to be removed. They said that state marriage officers were employees of the state, and therefore they had effectively abdicated their right to religious freedom. Well, we said there's absolutely no possible constitutional interpretation that can give you that outcome, because that right is to you as an individual. You don't simply lose it because you chose to be employed by the state. In fact, the state, if anything, should be upholding and protecting it. And we also felt that there were other and better solutions for the problems that they were saying this was going to solve. It ended up, unfortunately, and it should never have been this way, a sort of a winner-takes-all situation. And the bill was, in fact, passed. And that meant that state marriage officers could potentially be compelled, even if their convictions were contrary, to...
Certainly that their definition, for instance, of marriage is that it's only between a man and a woman.
If they had a conscientious objection reason as to why they did not feel they could solemnize a marriage between, say, same-sex couples, that right to conscientious objection was removed from them, and they could therefore potentially be forced. Now, that's now become somewhat academic, because as we'll get to at the end, we now have the marriage bill,
yes,
which is also going to be a very interesting one, and which will effectively rewrite the marriage laws of South Africa.
And this is, and just a side note, this was effectively Cope's swan song. It was the last thing they really did in Parliament.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, it's one of the very few private members' bills, I think there's only been about 3, that actually have ever got to the state where they're passed.
That's interesting. So if we go back there, we are looking at the second line there, and where 4SA would have opposed the bill, the only parties that in fact did so was the ACDP. I see the Freedom Front Plus didn't vote. The NFP voted against it, and then the African Independent Council voted. Those were the only 3 parties. The rest all either abstained or voted in favor of that bill.
Correct.
Okay, let's go to the next one.
Well, the Domestic Violence Amendment Bill was, again, in and of itself, obviously domestic violence is a bad thing.
And it's a horrific problem in our land.
It's a huge problem. I mean, gender-based violence and femicide is the great plague and scourge that we are facing, and everybody needs to obviously do whatever they can to resolve it. The concern we had with this particular bill was that there was, and this is of course a criminal issue, was that it introduced a brand new definition or a brand new term into law of spiritual abuse.
Yes.
And the question is, well, what do you mean by spiritual abuse? What makes spiritual abuse different from any other form of abuse? And for us, that was very concerning because, of course, when you get a definition in law, it's a little bit like a virus. Once it's established in this particular bill, it then will morph and transfer into all sorts of other bills. So how you define something, like it's the first time it gets defined, is absolutely critical. And we, FORSA, we do what we always do, which is we try to come up with not just we oppose it, but here's a solution.
Yes.
And we developed a definition of what spiritual abuse should be in our view. And to paraphrase it, it was narrowly defined to mean that if, for example, you converted from one faith to another, nobody should then be able to abuse you or to come after you or to treat you maliciously or badly or violently, God forbid, simply because you've converted from one faith to another. Now, if you had maybe left it open-ended, it could be, well, you know, the pastor made an appeal for finance for a building fund and I gave a lot of money, but I was emotionally, you know, abused, and that's spiritual abuse. No. And it all came down to this. In the committee, where often these things are settled, a member of the committee, who happened to be Steve Swart from the ACDP, when it came to this particular definition...
Who incidentally is a friend of our church.
Wonderful. Mm. And he said, let's put this definition in, and everybody said yes. So we actually got in a critical definition. So wherever now spiritual abuse is mentioned in law, in all likelihood they're going to take that as the definition, and therefore potentially we again sort of diffuse what could have been a ticking bomb, not just in that piece of legislation, but in other subsequent pieces as well.
And let's maybe have a look at how everybody voted. That was now basically no votes were recorded. Is that at committee stage?
Yes, and so the ACDP basically voted effectively, in favor of it, but with that definition in.
Okay, so and the reason why they have the cross next to them is because they assisted in amending that definition.
Correct.
Okay, and so they're called with a 4SA status. Okay, let's go to the Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terror and Related Activities Amendment Bill. Quite a mouthful.
Yes, and it was a mouthful, and it was one of the sort of anti-terrorist bills. There was a sort of a series of them that were really potentially or primarily put forward to try and stop for South Africa being grey listed.
Yes,
which of course
this
has
is
a lot of financial
this of course
issues.
comes from severe international pressure.
Yes. And again, of course, it's, as is always the case, often the case, it's the devil being in the details. And there were very long, vague, broad definitions of what terrorist activity was or could be construed to be that potentially could have found religious freedom rights infringed, because you could have been found guilty of some terrorist-related crimes which weren't actually terrorist-related crimes at all. And that obviously had the potential to be punished. I mean, there were life sentences involved here.
Yes.
And so again, we were looking for a improvement to the definitions. Generally speaking, those definitions were improved. But again, now this legislation has been passed, we don't quite know how it's going to be. And that's the problem.
Yes.
Because you never quite know how it's going to be actually interpreted or when it's going to be used. Once a piece of legislation becomes law and act, it is in force and enforceable until such time as it's either overturned or there's a court case that basically challenges some or all of it, and that gets amended by the court. So that is always the problem. Once a piece of legislation is passed, you're stuck with it.
Yes.
And it can take a long time before it actually gets amended properly, even though it might be unconstitutional.
So can you tell us what your specific reservations about the bill was?
Again, it was more the fact that the overbroad definitions could potentially have caught legitimate bona fide
religious
expression and freedoms, and supporting, for example, missionaries and that type of thing.
Because that's one of the big issues around grey listing, is the support of missionaries.
Yes.
And can unfortunately be tarred with the same brush.
And that was the subject of the next piece of legislation we're going to be looking at.
So let's quickly have a look at this. So protection, and there the ANC voted in favour, the EFF voted in favour, the IFP voted in favour. We don't know what the NFP did. Could you maybe explain?
Undisclosed. It basically means that they reserved a position. They didn't vote for or against. It was effectively an abstaining. Okay,
so the three parties that accorded with your position were the DA, the ACDP, and the Freedom Front Plus.
Correct.
Okay, let's look at the general laws, and this is specifically referred to Anti-Money Laundering and Combating Terrorism Financing Amendment Bill. I think assisted Daniela with this.
Yes.
And attended 1 or 2 committee meetings with her.
Wonderful.
Online.
Yeah, perfect, Richard. Thank you. Well, yeah, you have been an incredible help to us and to the faith communities of South Africa with your legal expertise. It's been fantastic. But again, here one of the big problems that we saw was the fact that potentially they could require you to amend your constitution to basically fit in with what they thought you should be to be compliant with this anti-money laundering. But the danger, of course, is that you could literally be forced to amend your founding documents. And that could mean, for example, you'd have to change the qualification or the criteria that you as a church want to put in place for who can be a leader.
Because of course,
or who can be a member.
Because of course, with these provisions, they come in under the guise of anti-terrorism, and then crowd through all kinds of rights issues and their interpretation of rights, which is really where the problem with this bill was.
And so you often get what we call the law of unintended consequences, where a piece of legislation that is passed for a specific purpose is subsequently used for a purpose for which it was never intended. But the fact that it is now law, it's just a question of how will the courts then interpret it, and if it's used adversely against you, then you're now put in the position where you have to defend yourself. And as we said, that can be a very concerning thing. So our biggest concern here was that it was a type of state regulation of religion through the back door.
Yes.
In other words, if
Yes.
they can have the power to tell you to amend your constitution, and therefore what you can and cannot do, who can and cannot be a leader or a member of your church or whatever, effectively they have the capacity to regulate you. Now again, there's no saying that they will do that, but once a piece of law is on the statute books, once it becomes an act, then you don't know what's going to happen. It's like a sleeper. It just sort of sits there.
And let's be clear, some of this is the product of very bad drafting.
Yes, and that is unfortunately also the case, is that laws are often not necessarily, and I think it's important to say that we never attribute bad intentions to government. We take the assumption that they're trying to do the best that they can, and that they're trying to act in the best interests of people according to their view of what that best interest may be. But the fact of the matter is that when it comes to the drafting, as you say, sometimes they're very poorly drafted.
Yes.
And we often have to contend things because of the fact that it's just badly written and it needs to be tightened
And
up.
this was under huge pressure, so they were going to rush through the most dreadful law.
Yes, very broad, very sweeping, very concerning. And fortunately, again, we did manage to defang some of it. But again, this has now been passed. It was passed under pressure, which is never a good
No, it's never a good thing.
context for making law. But there it is.
Yeah, in fact, in its original form, it was probably the most alarming piece of legislation with regards to religious freedom since the CRL's
Yes.
attempts many years ago to regulate religion.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's have a look at the record here. And we are...
General Laws, Anti-Money Laundering and Combating
Yes.
Terrorism Financing Amendment Bill. What a long...
It's a total mouthful. And the two parties that voted in favor were the ANC and EFF, the DA, ACDP, Freedom Front voted against it. The IFP, the NFP, all the way through to Good. They all voted in favor of...
No, you're looking at the wrong column.
Am I at the wrong column?
You were,
Oh,
you were
yes,
right.
yeah,
you were right first
originally.
time. Yeah,
I
those who voted
apologize.
for it, the
Yes.
ANC, the EFF, those who voted against it and aligned with FORSA's position were the DA, the ACDP, and Freedom Front Plus.
Then a much more explicitly religious bill, or potentially dealing with religious issues, is the hate speech bill.
Very concerning.
Yes, and still concerning.
Well, still very concerning, because, again, this was a lengthy process, and there were 3 rounds of public participation that went into it. And we want to say thank you to every single person that engaged in that. Over 250,000 people
Yes.
over the 3 public engagement processes actually wrote individually to say, we don't want this, we don't need this. And the problem with this bill, of course, is, again, always in the definitions.
Yes.
And here you have a bill, and its title is The Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech, but the definition of hate was not defined. It wasn't in the bill.
Yes.
And that's hugely problematic because this carries potentially a 5-year jail sentence.
Yes.
How can you have certainty, which is one of the principles of lawmaking, which we believe is one good reason why this is unconstitutional, this bill, unless you actually know what constitutes the crime that you're supposed to be committing? The other problem was, of course, the subjectivity of it, the fact that it was so much broader than the definition of hate speech in the Constitution, and even the definition of hate speech in the civil equivalent, where if you're found to have infringed that, you can be fined or you can be made to make an apology or something. It was even wider than that. And that means that it's literally, if this is signed, and it's literally waiting to be signed now, please God, Mr. President, don't sign this. It was passed by the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. So they effectively left it very open-ended. One of the biggest problems is that it includes, for example, hate speech is substantial emotional harm.
Yes.
It's so subjective.
It becomes very effectively, when you deal with a crime is really about what your intention is. So you can do something with a specific intention, and it isn't necessarily a crime, or you can do it with a malevolent intention or a negligent intention, and it is a crime. So to a great degree, crime had always been defined in terms of the animus, the
mens rea and
mens
the actus
rea,
reus.
yes, of the doer, while this for the first time moved the definition of crime onto the recipient
Yes.
of the action.
And therefore it's entirely subjective. And of course, the adjudication of it by a judge will really depend upon
Yes.
which judge you get and what they think about things.
So you could do something with a good intention, and it's interpreted as a malevolent intention by the person who receives it,
Precisely.
making it a crime.
Yeah, because what I might say something which to you is perfectly inoffensive, but to somebody else it might
Yes.
be deeply offensive.
Yes.
And therefore that should never be a criteria. The other problem was that we particularly pressed for a robust religious freedom exemption to be put in this bill. We wanted it to say that if you said something expressing a good faith religious
Yes.
expression, whatever that might be, that would be an absolute defense. And the clause that they put in was actually really no defense
Yes.
in a real sense at all. It said that you're not guilty of hate speech according to this bill, unless what you said is actually within the definition of
Yes.
hate speech according to
Yes.
this bill.
Very poorly drafted.
Very
and
badly drafted.
and difficult to. I remember I had a discussion on your channel, on your 4SS channel, with Glynis Breitenbach. She felt it
Yes.
was, and let me be clear that this bill, although it has real religious implications, I actually think that it'll create the greatest damage in the political arena.
Yes.
Because I think it's going to be misused by political parties in the years to come. So
It didn't just affect religious speech,
Yes.
it affected all expression. So, even journalism and
Yes.
media and that type of thing. I mean, everybody,
Academia.
there was almost unanimous opposition to this bill. And yet, for some reason,
it was forced through.
it was forced through.
Yes.
And it now waits on the president's desk. So in order for a piece of legislation to go from a bill to law, it has to go through the processes and be passed by both houses of parliament, which is the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces, then it's the NA or the NCOP. And it only becomes law when the president himself or herself, if we ever have a female
Yes.
president, actually signs it off. The president hasn't signed it off, but it is sitting on his desk. It has been passed by parliament.
What's interesting also is we had quite a seminal case, the Kwelani case, where hate speech was quite acutely defined by the Constitutional Court. And this goes quite considerably past what the Constitutional Court said hate speech was.
Absolutely. And that's a very interesting case, the Kwelani case, because the definition of hate speech in the Equality Act was deemed or called out by the court as unconstitutional and unlawful.
And that's a civil.
That's a civil act.
Yes.
But here's the thing: when we talk about law being enforced and enforceable, in 2021, they said the Constitutional Court that definition of hate speech in the Equality Act is unlawful and unconstitutional. But it had been enforced and enforceable since the year 2000.
Yes.
So for 21 years,
Yes.
you had an unlawful, unconstitutional definition of hate
people,
speech.
And people, because what people don't understand is that there are a lot of matters that aren't necessarily litigated. People look at the act, assess the costs, and fold, in a sense.
It is often the intimidation factor of it. It's like what might happen. And you tend to therefore self-censor,
Yes.
which is concerning.
Yes.
Because free speech in particular is an absolute foundation of democracy.
Yes.
And the reason why we arrive at sometimes very sensible, good solutions is because we can have robust discussions. We can take polarized opposite viewpoints
Yes.
and meet somehow in the middle.
And that's been somewhat of a South African strength. And I think this bill has a chilling effect. So let's have a look at the scorecard. And here we go. Let's hope I get the right line now. And so there was quite a lot of votes. The 4SA would have voted against it, quite rightly. The ANC voted in favor of it and really rammed it through. The DA voted against it, the EFF in favor, the ACDP and Freedom Front against. IFP in favor. We don't know what Al-Jamar decided. NFP were in favor through to good. So only 3 of the parties understood the implications.
I do think that the narrative around the hate speech bill was it was supposed to be preventing racist speech. And obviously racist speech is terrible, horrible,
Yes.
egregious. Our contention was that there are already a common law
Yes.
offence called crimen injuria, under which people have been successfully prosecuted for speech that crosses the threshold where it really does denigrate someone's human dignity.
And another example is another regulation of it is Papuda, and we saw Penny Sparrow die in that jail.
Yes.
You know, so there is already considerable regulation of.
She was convicted under crimen injuria.
Yes.
Yeah. And found guilty or to
Yes.
found to have infringed Papuda, the Equality Act as well. Yeah.
Yes. So it was revisiting an issue, and with a badly designed, badly drafted act.
Correct.
Let's go to the expropriation bill.
Well, this has obviously been the subject of huge contention.
And if we may say, the contention has really been outside of the religious field.
Yes, yes. Our position on it was narrow. Essentially, what FORSA said was that we felt that there needed to be an exemption, because obviously the definition of expropriation isn't just restricted to property.
Yes.
It could be anything, down to literally the shirt on your back, in theory. Again, the definitions of the problem. And the fact is that expropriation without compensation means literally you get nothing.
Yes.
And our contention was that property owned by and particularly used for religious purposes should be completely exempt from the expropriation bill and from any form of expropriation, because obviously it's being used for the benefit of the community.
Specifically without compensation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes.
And unfortunately, that particular exemption clause was not included in the expropriation bill that has, or is effectively awaiting the president's signature. So it's been passed by both houses of parliament.
And it's still sitting there.
And
So
it's sitting, waiting. Will the president sign it before parliament ends? Will a future president sign it? Because even though this parliament may lapse, if it's been passed by both houses, it still could be resurrected and passed at some future date by some future president. And that's the danger. It's like a sleeper.
yes.
Yeah.
And here we go to who voted for what. FORSA would have opposed it on a let's be clear, a very narrow religious issue.
Yes.
While let's be honest, the majority of that bill dealt with other issues.
Yeah.
So the ANC voted in favor, the DA against, the EFF in favor, and the ACDP and Freedom Front also opposed it. And the Good Party voted in favor. So far, not so good. Then let's go to the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act, commonly known as the Bella Bill.
Yes, obviously hugely concerning for parents, particularly because it is a trend of the state generally, and I'm talking about globally as well, to try and claw back parents' what should be inalienable right to educate their own children, particularly in the early years of their development, and to essentially take away some of the powers. We were very concerned from a religious freedom point of view on the initial or early draft of the bill, because what that did was it basically said that it wanted to remove the management of the school property, the assets of the school, from the school governing body's discretion and centralize it with the MEC. Now, everybody knows that a huge number of churches meet on school premises.
Certainly in our northern areas, there are some school buildings where there's a church in every single classroom.
Correct. And of course, the obvious danger and concern is that if you now centralize that and everybody has to apply to the MEC for education, who knows what the outcome would be to your application. It could sit on his desk, it could have been nullified.
And that consideration is more real because during lockdown, of course, churches were excluded from
Yes.
school properties. And then after lockdown was lifted, they actually tried to continue that
Yes.
ban.
Yes. And we also contested that.
Yes.
So-
So this is real.
Yeah. Yeah. This is not just an idle threat.
Yes.
Yeah.
They've actually tried to exclude churches
Yeah.
from school properties.
Absolutely. And so
And it was only the outcry
Yes.
from churches that prevented that.
yes. So our position on the Bella Bill is that it isn't strictly a religious freedom issue, other than what we originally mentioned, and of course, like indirectly, of course, parental rights are being essentially overridden or potentially clawed back, but we didn't take any religious freedom position on this bill other than the original, which was to say, and again, that was taken out very quickly, so that was a good
Yes.
thing.
I just want to pick up, Kolisi Sonkwala says the EFF rejected the expropriation bill. I think that is the case. They did vote against it because they didn't feel it went far enough.
Oh.
But I think that the issue that you were picking up on was the issue of church or religious
Yeah.
property being taken away. And the EFF's position was that all property should belong to the state.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah.
So
It was a
so-
very sort of like, let's say, very extreme position when
Yes.
when looking at property rights.
Yes. So although they may have voted against the bill, the reason they voted against or the act is because they wanted the power to they wanted to expropriate all property from everybody.
So we will clarify that, and thank you, Kolisi Sonkwala, for that input.
Yeah. And I want to thank everyone that's been sharing the broadcast. Tina Carvalho, I'm sharing this. I love that. Okay, let's go back to the. So we were dealing with
Bella.
the Bella Bill. Yes. So where is the Bella Bill right now?
Well, it's been passed by the National Assembly. It's currently with the NCOP. There is a report being prepared on it as well. Obviously, there's been massive consultations all around the country.
And huge opposition.
Huge opposition. I think far greater opposition than is actually being acknowledged.
Yes.
But again, so all we're looking at this point is what happened at the National Assembly level.
And may I ask you, here, is there not a religious issue with regards to parents who want to homeschool their children? And I understand that there's quite a bit of restriction of homeschooling in that bill. I speak under correction here.
You could argue indirectly, but the question is to what level will the restrictions placed or the extra restrictions placed on homeschoolers actually impair their capacity to teach their children from a faith viewpoint? That isn't made clear. So again, yes, as I say, residually there could be concerns, but there were no, as far as our analysis of it went, apart from the original, obviously, schools meeting on property, very concerning that was. But after that was done, we pretty much, and we look at it every time it comes up, and we're always tracking it, so we don't just take our eye off the ball.
Yes.
But we haven't seen anything that is sufficiently, let's say, egregious for us to feel that we need to engage again.
So so let's just quickly have a look there. So your position is effectively neutral, and so in a sense, each party is then allowed a free vote
Yeah,
from a religious freedom point of view.
yeah, effectively, yes.
Okay. So let's jump to the Disaster Management Amendment Bill.
Well, this is an interesting one.
Yes.
This was introduced by the Freedom Front Plus, and it came right after a lockdown.
Yes.
Because the Disaster Management Bill was never designed
Yes.
to cope with the type of
It was
situation
misused.
that we faced. It was effectively misused. And they used it because if they had declared a state of emergency, for example, that
Yes.
would have been up for parliamentary review.
scrutiny.
Scrutiny. I think it's every 30 days they have to go back to Parliament. They didn't want to go back to Parliament every 30 days.
In fact, I filed papers on behalf of the ACDP arguing that the Disaster Management Act was A, unconstitutional, and B, their use of it was unconstitutional because they used it to circumvent scrutiny by Parliament.
Absolutely. It effectively shut down any meaningful engagement with Parliament.
We filed it about a week before about 5 days before they lifted the disaster management. ACDP, on behalf of ACDP, they brought an application to have the Disaster Management Act lifted.
So the purpose of this bill,
which state of disaster lifted,
the purpose of this Disaster Management Amendment Bill, which FORSA actually helped to draft, was to basically make sure that there was accountability,
yes,
and that the executive authority, which
yes,
was exercised by essentially a small group of ministers without any form of accountability, was actually fixed in
yes,
case there was a next time. God forbid, but
yes,
it could easily happen.
And
we basically proposed that it was only if you went to Parliament and the provinces that a state of, let's say, disaster was able to be extended.
Yes.
And that bill was rejected.
Yes.
So the ANC essentially voted against it. They did not allow that bill to proceed.
And it's an egregious violation of our rights. And one of because they had intended to extend the disaster management. We weren't the only people who filed papers. Sakaliga also filed an application. We joined them, or brought another application. And very early in the lockdown, Max du Plessis, who was one of the counsel in the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, he filed papers on behalf of Helen Suzman Foundation, arguing that the circumvention of Parliament is a violation of constitutional rights.
Well, which actually is interesting. And some things are not part of this scorecard,
yes,
but one of the big things that we contested was that right as lockdown ended, they amended, or they tried to amend, the health regulations,
yes,
so that the powers that had been enjoyed,
yes,
by the Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma,
yes,
Cogta, would be transferred to the Minister of Health, and
yes,
he would then be able to declare a sort of a state of national emergency or national disaster, and actually take on even greater powers, yes, than they had enjoyed. At that point, again, well done everybody who wrote, yes, in, because we had 350,000 people in that campaign who said, yes, no, and that literally died on the vine.
Yes.
So there was a real, I would say, existential threat to democratic governance,
yes,
that was posed by lockdown and even attempted subsequent to lockdown.
And a real power grab by the administrative state.
Absolutely.
Circumventing Parliament. So let's go to the voting there. So we are the disaster management. The parties that were in favor were the ACDP, the Freedom Front Plus, and the IFP. And FORSA was very much in favor of it. And the reason why is because that act had been used to yes, lock down churches, yeah, shut churches down.
So we and all those with the tech wanted it to be amended to make sure that there was much more scrutiny, accountability and scrutiny.
And obviously deliberation over who should be shut down, who should be controlled.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And so those who are across in that instance are people who basically did not want those amendments to be made.
Yes. And to be honest, as someone who spent a lot of time on that issue, I find it very, very difficult to understand why they would vote against a bill like that. And yeah, I need to pay tribute to the ACDP who, and I must disclose, briefed me in two cases to deal with this. Okay. So I see that, the Good Party once again voted with the ANC. The DA voted with the ANC. The EFF voted with the ANC. But this is.
I think it's important to point out, because somebody is pointing this out, that we are not saying that the reason why parties voted for, yes, or against something was because they are anti-religious freedom.
Yes.
They may have had other reasons,
yes,
good reasons, why they voted the way that they did. We're not saying one way or another. What we are saying is that the net result position is that something was passed or not allowed to proceed that could potentially impact and affect religious freedom.
Let's jump to the Constitution 18th Amendment Bill. What was this about?
Well, this was an attempt to actually alter the Constitution,
Yes.
so that expropriation without compensation, nil compensation, would be allowed. And again, like the expropriation bill, it would effectively have had the same effect in a sense.
Yes.
But
Although amending the Constitution is far more far-reaching.
it is, yes, because then it absolutely sets it in stone.
Yes.
And you need, of course, a different majority.
Yes.
So you need a 2/3 majority in order to get something passed. The ANC couldn't get that, and therefore this bill effectively was just lapsed.
And what were the religious freedom issues here?
Well, again, exactly the ones that we were concerned about under the expropriation bill, which is that if you expropriate without compensation, that would mean that there would be no protection for religious organizations using property for religious purposes, which we obviously believe is very much integral in the benefiting the community. And why would you ever even consider taking that away? So again, once you take a clause out of the Constitution, there's no nuance to it. It's just gone. And that's why we felt that it should be opposed effectively, that it shouldn't go through, and it didn't go through.
And let's quickly go to the scorecard, the 18th, and there the 4SA would have voted against it. The DA voted, EFF voted against it, the Freedom Front Plus voted against it.
It was essentially rejected.
Yes, and let's be clear that most of those parties weren't voting on religious grounds.
No.
Yes. Let's go to the spy bill. Now, let's be clear: the original version of this would have made Kim Jong-un proud from North Korea. It was the most egregious bill I think I've ever seen.
Yeah, well, the first version of the bill literally said that if you wanted to open a church, if you were a pastor or a religious leader, you had to be vetted, or you could be vetted, to see whether or not you were a threat to national security.
By the security service.
By the security services. And if you were found to not be sufficiently compliant with what they wanted you to be, then effectively you would be shut down. And this is obviously a very serious situation. And so the definitions in this bill, they then withdrew that and they put another version in, which we felt in some ways was even worse, because again, the broader you make definitions, which is a kind of a catch-all net, even though the claim was, well, we're not going to target religious leaders, we're not going to shut down, religious voices who might be critical of government. Well, the answer is, well, who says? Because, of course, once you've got a piece of law on the statute books, then you can do pretty much what you want. And so the definitions were too wide. We strongly petitioned, and again, thank you everybody who participated in that campaign. I think we had over 23,000 people voted on something which was not like core religious freedom, but again, the unintended consequences in the definitions. And the good news is that this current version has been vastly improved. So there's much more oversight, from the judicial oversight to who can and cannot be targeted. Where you were originally not even going to be informed if you were being targeted by this thing, and they could have looked at anything and everything to do with you: your WhatsApp, your internet activity, your cell phone calls, your conversations. Everything was basically open to scrutiny, and you wouldn't even know about it.
And let's be clear that there needed to be a spy bill.
Yes.
For spying reasons.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, the government has a job to do. They must keep the country safe from spies, external and internal. And so nobody was saying that they don't have the right to do that that's not an important thing for government to do. It obviously is.
And it was necessary to reform the security services because they had been so egregiously misused.
Yes, exactly.
So it was a good idea to have a bill, but unfortunately, let's be honest, it was terrible. I mean, the worst dictatorships in the world would have enjoyed the first one.
So the good news is now that although it has been passed by the National Assembly, it's been passed in a very different form than the original one that we were concerned about. There are still vagueness in the definitions. It is now before the National Council of Provinces, and they have actually opened up another public participation process, which we learned this week. That's open until May the 12th, but it's basically not going to be able to alter anything major. So FORSA will be making a submission, but there isn't time for like general public to get involved again. But again, thanks to everybody who did, because we believe that was one of the key reasons. When we were meeting with members of parliament on the committee,
Yes.
we met them and they were well aware that this was a matter of deep concern to the faith communities.
Yes.
And that was one of the reasons why they were pushing for the amendments to be made.
Because there was such a because it I'm just battling for the word. It unashamedly targeted the faith communities initially.
It did in its original draft, and the
Yes.
question was, well,
Why? Why
Yeah.
are you targeting the church,
Yeah.
the Muslims, the mosque, or whatever?
Yeah.
So let's go to the voting there. There we see.
Well, at the moment, it hasn't actually gone forward.
Yes.
So they've basically made the amendments and they've put it to the NCOP. So that was basically how it went. But again, it is a much better version.
And
than
this
it
was initially proposed by government.
Yes,
Okay.
correct.
Let's go to the marriage bill.
Well, again, this is something which is the product of a desire to reform the whole area of legislation governing marriage in South Africa.
Because there were several marriages.
We had three different acts of parliament. One dealt with sort of traditional customary marriages. One dealt with, let's say, civil union, same-sex marriages, but other non-religious marriages. And then the marriage bill dealt with the more religious marriages, particularly Christian-based marriages. And there were some gaps that needed to be filled as well.
And you could get married under two different acts.
Yes, you could. And interestingly enough, if you were licensed under one act, you could not perform a marriage ceremony under another act, which was a good protection because
It's
of
an
course,
excellent protection.
The Marriage Act had, and still has because it's still in force, the original Marriage Act, a particular conscientious objection clause which protected the conscientious objection rights.
It also defined marriages between a man and a woman.
Yes.
And so only heterosexual marriage could take place in terms of that act.
Yes, although heterosexual marriages could also take place under the Civil Union Act.
But that's the point.
Yes.
Is that because of the separation.
So the big issue in the policy round, which was the first thing that happens, is that government produces a policy, and the policy then typically will and should direct what happens with the law that they then write. And the big contention there was, will there be a robust protection for the conscientious objection rights of religious marriage officers? Because you should never be forced to do something to solemnize a marriage which goes against your convictions and belief, or those of whatever faith grouping you might be representing. And originally, one of the views was, well, actually, no, you are, in a sense, representing the state, and therefore you should be forced to represent, or to solemnize all marriages.
That, of course, suggests that the state invented marriage.
Yes. So the policy ended up basically recognizing that there should be a protection. The concern was, and now we're looking at the marriage bill itself, that when the first draft of the marriage bill came out, it did not contain that robust protection.
And that was after a huge amount of lobbying.
Yes. And of course, the concern would be, even though it was, well, don't worry, because, we've already put it in the policy. It's like, yes, but maybe somebody might argue, looking at the marriage bill, if it becomes law, the fact that it's not there means that there was an opportunity to object.
Yes.
And as we know, there are certain activists that would be very quick to perhaps come after the faith community.
Yes.
We lobbied, many people lobbied. Again, well done everybody for participating. And now I'm happy to say that there is now a robust protection for the religious freedom rights of religious marriage officers. You cannot be compelled to solemnize them.
We do need to note that this bill does recognize a number of different types of marriage which certainly from a Christian perspective, people wouldn't agree with.
Yes.
But because FORSA takes a neutral point of view, the
Correct.
issue is, are those religious rights protected?
Yes.
In expression, not whether it's a Christian act or not.
Exactly. So some people would, for example, argue that the definition of marriage itself is wrong. And they're entitled to obviously that
Yes.
view, and many people will hold that view, but
Yes.
that is not strictly a religious freedom issue.
Yes.
And again, our biggest concern, and it remains a concern, and so we're going to be continuing to engage in it, is that state-employed marriage officers were not included.
Thanks to COPE.
Were not included in the protection given to religious marriage officers. So that's still an area of contention. So we still want to go back and, let's say, re-engage in that battle, because there is absolutely no reason why, just because you work for the state, you should somehow lose your religious freedom right.
So let's have a look at, so we don't have voting at this stage. From a religious point of view, FORSA would vote in favor of the act, although I know some other prominent lobbyists, like for instance Errol Naidu, would strongly opposes it, but that's because his mandate is a Christian mandate.
Correct.
Okay, so that's the overall scorecard. You can look at who's done what. Obviously, there would be policy considerations external to religion in some of these votes. But overall, I think that we can say that the two parties that have, actually the three parties that have voted most consistently towards freedom are the ACDP, the Freedom Front, and then the DA.
Yes.
So this is not, we are not taking a position on why they voted. We are just simply reporting who voted towards freedom of religion.
Or who voted, whether they intended to
Yes,
protect religious freedom
that's
or
true.
not,
Yes.
in favor effectively
Yes.
of religious freedom.
Yes.
Because our vote would have been in the first column under the FORSA what we stand for,
Yes.
and how the different political parties aligned in their voting would indicate effectively whether they intended to defend religious freedom or
Yes.
not. They effectively did.
And so we ask you to look very carefully at this when considering your vote, who to vote for. Now, early childhood development toolkit. I think this is the one issue we need to cover. Tell us very quickly what this early development, childhood development toolkit is.
Well, this is a teacher training program that was developed particularly by a unit set up within the Department of Basic Education, the Social Cohesion and Equity in Education unit. And it was funded largely by a donation of 40 million rand from a Belgian organization called VVOB. And our concern with this is that it applies to pre-primary and primary school ages. So we're talking little children here.
Yes.
And it is laden with transgender ideology. Now, I want to be very clear. We absolutely respect the rights of every single person to make whatever choices they want for the lifestyle that they lead, who they believe that they are, how they may dress, whether they have surgery to correspond to the gender that they believe that they are. They're entitled to do that. They're entitled to believe
but
whatever they want to
specifically
believe.
from the age from when they can legitimately make that decision.
Exactly. But if you start to teach the ideology behind that, in a sense, which is that you are a man just because you say or believe that you're a man, even though you may be biologically a woman, or vice versa, and you start to bring that into the classroom, and you're starting to create a culture and a context, particularly in the little ones.
Yes.
We're talking about 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds here who have no way of processing from a developmental cognitive point of view the accuracy of that. And you literally start to teach teachers to train children or to engage with children with that ideology and to promote that ideology. That is going to go very squarely against what many parents are actually teaching their children. And so we've looked at this toolkit. And by the way, this is happening already. It's not like it might happen at some point. it has already been piloted in KwaZulu-Natal. I think that was in 2019 already.
Yeah.
And it is certainly, as far as we have evidence and acknowledgement from the Department of Basic Education, at least 5 provinces, and it could be more. So it's happening.
And they're being very secretive about it.
Well, they haven't opened it up for a parental overview, shall we say, or input. They claim that they don't have to because, of course, this is the teacher training.
Yeah.
And they say that they're entitled to train teachers. That's their purview. That's their, right, if you like. But the question is, well, what are you teaching them? I mean, this isn't a blackboard technique that they're being trained. They're being trained to literally introduce this ideology into the whole context and culture of schools. And therefore, the question isn't so much what are you being taught, teachers, but what are you going to do with that teaching? And the answer is you're going to be teaching it to little children.
So I want to just ask you to read from the toolkit. So this is what is being taught to children.
Well, this is what's teachers are being trained in. So what I'm going to read now are quotes actually out of this toolkit. And again, we were lambasted by the Department of Basic Education. They actually put out a tweet accusing us of spreading fake news.
Yes.
We then repeated the tweet with a minor adjustment, and we put the stamp fact check, because people are entitled to basically just simply look at what's been produced. It's got their logo on it. It's got their the VVOB logo on it. You can see it. It's online. It's not being hidden away. And these are actual quotes from this toolkit that you can verify for yourself. And if you want more information, by the way, go to the forsa.org.za website. But it says this: many families and communities hold to prevailing harmful gender roles and boundaries, and may also impose gender stereotypes and expectations on children. Now, effectively what that's saying is that if you as a parent are teaching your child that there are only men and women and boys and girls, according to this, that is seen as harmful. That is very concerning, because you're actually telling little children that your parents are teaching you something that may be harming you. How is that in the best interest of a child?
Yes.
How is that not deeply divisive in terms of families? Here's another exact quote. Growing up, it says, many of us were taught that if you were identifying a single person by a pronoun, you had to use he or she. They was only for groups of people. Those rules have changed. Well, the question is who changed them and when,
Yes.
because English grammar has been established for centuries, in a sense, and our use of it has also been, very well established. But it says, and I go on, quoting, they or them is now a non-binary way to address someone. Using they and them, and this is the reason they want to use they and them, lets children know that we cannot assume someone's gender identity just by looking at them. That literally means that children are going to be taught, if you're sitting next to a little girl, Johnny, who's called Jenny, just because she looks like a little girl, just because she has the name of a little girl, doesn't mean to say that she is a little girl. She might be a little boy, and maybe her preferred name might be Jimmy, and maybe he's a she or a they or who knows what.
Yes.
And how confusing is that for children? You're literally telling a child, you cannot believe your eyes.
Yes.
It's such a fundamental issue that the real issue really is an issue of truth, because obviously the biological reality of whether you're a man or a woman is actually decided at the point of conception.
Yes.
It's not like your gender assigned at birth.
Yes.
You were a boy or a girl literally from the moment of conception.
And it goes even deeper than that. Do you have a YY chromosome, or do you have an XY chromosome?
And there are certain, obviously, aberrations like
Yes.
intersex, and there are certain very rare genetic conditions. But this is not being taught for that reason. And very interestingly, and maybe we can look at another example, because I think we've got another example, just to, again, emphasize that what is happening here isn't education. It is much more indoctrination. It says here, most of us have been raised with the idea that there are two sexes, male and female, and that they align with two genders, man and woman. However, it says both sex and gender exist across a continuum of possibilities. And the role of ECD, early childhood development teachers, it says that they play a central role in providing equal opportunities for all children to engage and learn and help them to break free from harmful gender stereotypes that hold them back in life. And again, nobody is against people who have, let's say, confusion over their gender. It's a very real thing. It's a very serious thing and potentially a very dangerous thing if you have that level of confusion. Nobody is saying that they shouldn't be protected, their rights shouldn't be supported, they shouldn't be literally given as much accommodation as is reasonably possible in that context. The only thing that's being said is that you should not be taking one single ideological viewpoint on sex and gender and then say that that is the only one that we're going to adhere to.
Especially because this is increasingly contrary to this scientific fact. First of all, that their biological sex is a fact, where many people would disagree with. In this ideology, they potentially disagree with us. And then secondly, there was a very large study that came out in the UK in the last week or two.
Called the Cass report.
Yes. Maybe if you could tell us about it, to the extent that you know.
Well, essentially what the Cass report says is that the big concern is that, of course, what people believe pretty soon has consequences. And so if a child has been affirmed from an early age in their belief that they are a boy when they are in fact a girl, or whatever it may be, that you get to a certain point where now you start to have medical interventions that are literally irreversible. So things like puberty blockers were never designed for this purpose. Therapy where they give estrogen or testosterone.
And this creates long-term damage in the child.
It does. Irreversible damage. It effectively sterilizes. It also locks in the confusion and the condition. And that then can go on to literally what they call gender reassignment surgeries, where they cut off healthy parts of a young person's body. It has irreversible impacts which will affect them for the rest of their life. I'd like to just say one thing, though, just to clarify. When we're talking about, obviously, two sexes, male and female, there is obviously a wide divergence between a man who can be very effeminate or a woman who can be very masculine. That doesn't mean to say that they change sex. It may well be that a woman who is very masculine may end up being same-sex attracted, and a man who is very effeminate may end up being same-sex attracted. But it doesn't change the reality of the fact that they are still and always will be a man and a woman. And this is an ideology because it's effectively saying that there is actually this construct which, if you simply believe or say that you are something, that's who you are. And how can a little child decide that? I mean, my little nephew, when he was young, he said he was a dinosaur. He went around roaring and jumping around and growling and stuff. I mean, it's cute. But at some point you say to him, actually, you're not a dinosaur. Or he works it out for himself. And of course, typically, this gender confusion self-corrects when children go through puberty.
A study came out last week saying that.
Yes, precisely. That's the Cass report.
So let's quickly go, what can you do about it?
Well, the most important thing to do if you are concerned about this is to make sure that your voice is heard. And the best way to do that is if you can see on the screen, there's actually a QR code that you could scan and go directly to. We're working again with Dear South Africa, and they have set up a platform where literally in 2 minutes you can make your voice heard. You can put in a comment if you want to. You can either just agree on a particular position that you want to say. You can oppose it or you can support it, by the way. So it's an objective survey, and then that will send an email straight to the Department of Basic Education. So again, have your say, because if enough people perhaps speak out against this, then we are hoping and trusting that the Department of Basic Education will reconsider.
We're now at 18,400 comments.
So that's up about 10,000 from Friday. So it does seem that people are waking up to the fact that this is something which is happening and they're not happy with it.
So I want to encourage you to go and comment. It's so important that you have your voice heard. One of the, I see Mkolisi saying mentioning the issues surrounding the Constitution. But one of the good things about our Constitution is that it forces real consultation
Yes.
and public participation.
It's so important.
Yes. And so it's so important that we do something about this and we don't sit on our hands, because we really actually can have an effect by
Yes.
participating.
100%. It is ultimately, one voice is a very quiet whisper, but, and the numbers are increasing, 18,000 voices, that
Yes.
starts to become a shout.
Yes.
And
Especially just before the election.
well, and again, we did not do this at all as an electioneering issue.
Yes.
We had met with a coalition of 20 million
Yes.
people represented at the highest levels by different faith communities, from the Islamic faith, from the Christian faith, and from the African traditional spirituality faith. We had met with the department, we had appealed to them, and essentially when they rejected our appeal, and they actually wrote in capital letters, which is pretty emphatic, we will continue, we then tried to go to the minister directly, we tried to go to the office of the president directly. We took 4 months to try to find a way of actually talking about this before making it public. It was only when all those efforts were either
Yes.
ignored or rebuffed that we felt we cannot in good conscience simply just leave this matter as a private matter, because it infringes parental rights.
Yes.
You have the right as a parent to raise your child according to your own values. And if your child's being taught something different, you might not even be aware of it.
Considerably different.
Considerably different than what you might believe. And look, if you believe it and you're happy with it, no problem.
Yes. That's
But
your
if
right
you're
as
not,
a parent.
then we believe that you should at least know what's being taught, and now you have the opportunity to actually write to the DBE and let them know your views.
So please go and comment. You can go onto the FORSA website. You can also find it on Dear SA,
It's Dear South Africa, not Dear SA.
Dear South Africa. Sorry. Okay. Dear South Africa, and the link is up on the screen. If we can just put it back up there, and then also there is a link that you can just click on, if that can be put into the comments.
You can go to the FORSA website too.
Yes.
So right on our homepage, you'll see there's the first image you're going to see. It says "Have Your Say," which takes you
Yes.
through to that Dear South Africa site, or you can get more information, and there's more information.
And then, obviously, this is an organization, as you can see, that does a lot of work, and they need support. I'm sure you would agree with that statement.
That's us, right? Not
Yes.
the DBE.
Yes, they've got plenty. I see that the link for SA's website has been posted in the website. So please go and support them financially. They need more finances. There's so much work that has to be done. I think in the era of coalition politics, when there's going to be so many more voices, it's going to become even more time consuming.
And again, we exist to protect the right to religious freedom. And we are effectively, I think, the only watchman on the wall when it comes to protecting religious freedom. And we've been doing this for 10 years. And I believe that without FORSA, we'd be living in
Yes.
a very different context. You would see what's happened overseas here
Yes.
already.
Yes.
So
We've been able to dilute so much of the legislation, and let me not take too much credit for it. It's really Michael and his team. I've only been a small help. Anyway,
great.
Bottom line is, that's the election scorecard. We ask you to share this link with as many people as possible. I think this is important information that you need to know, and voters across South Africa need to know, because we need to vote, and every responsible citizen should vote in South Africa, even if you vote for a party that I don't think you should, and I can think of a few. Please vote.
Absolutely. It's I think, best stated as a civic duty, maybe.
Yes.
Have your say. This is a democracy. Let's keep it that way.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone, for joining. I see my friend Shalom has joined. Thank you for joining, and I trust that this will be a blessing to you and that you will learn from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.